Good afternoon. I'm Juliane Campfield, the director at Deutsches Haus at NYU. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our Kraft event today, a conversation among Jonas Lüscher, Tess Lewis, and Ulrich Baer. We are delighted to present this event, or I should say co-present this event together with our wonderful friends at the Consulate General of Switzerland in New York. And I want to especially thank Aita Pult, the cultural attaché there, and Elena Benninger, who were really instrumental in making this happen. Thank you, Elena and Aita. We are also presenting this event as part of NYU's International Education Week, and you can find out more about International Education Week by visiting that NYU website. It feels wonderful to present this event. It feels, I mentioned this earlier, a little bit like a Heimspiel, since we have worked with Jonas, with Tess, and with Uli before. Jonas was a writer in residence at Deutsches Haus at NYU many years ago. I think it was 2015, which is also when he participated in our annual festival Neue Literatur. And so it's a homecoming in a way, in a virtual way, I should say. And we are delighted that this is happening today. I also would like to thank the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their support of our academically inclined events. And I would like to thank, of course, Jonas for writing this phenomenal novel, and Tess, who is Jonas's translator and a translator in general, also an author, also a curator, and a good friend of Deutsches Haus. Thank you, Tess, for being on board with this and for your beautiful translation. The book just came out with FSG, so if you'd like to buy it, and I think you should buy it if you don't already own it, please buy it. And you can probably find all the information on the FSG website. And if you prefer to read it in German and don't speak German yet, you can, of course, take a language class at Deutsches Haus at NYU and then read the book in German. And before I introduce our wonderful speakers, let me just briefly, very briefly, mention a few upcoming events. On Monday, we'll present a anniversary celebration for Paul Celan, who would have turned 100, and we are co-organizing this with Ulrich Baer, Amir Eshel, and Nitzan Leibovich from Lehigh University and Stanford University, respectively. So if you have time, please join us. We'll have a chorus of international transdisciplinary voices paying homage to Paul Celan. I think it's at 12 on Monday. I also want to mention an upcoming conference we're doing on Germany, an inventory of the now, where we'll have 4 panel conversations looking at political, cultural, and other developments currently happening in Germany. And last but not least, I want to mention another literary event that we're doing together with Tess Lewis, who will curate that. It's a conversation called Upended, and it will include a Swiss, German, Austrian, and US author. Tess will moderate it, and we just learned that Jonas will also be involved in this event, and we're really delighted. Last but not very least, one more thank you that goes to FSG's Lauren Roberts, who got the ball rolling on this event, so to speak, because she sent us Kraft, and Sarah was so excited, and then the rest is history. And here we are with 3 good old friends. And having said that, I will now briefly read you the bio information for Jonas, Tess, and Uli, and then we'll start. Jonas Lüscher, the author of Barbarian Spring, a most humorous and convincing satire of the ridiculous excesses of those responsible for the financial crisis, returns to the topic of neoliberal arrogance in Kraft, his Swiss Book Prize-winning, hilarious and wicked novel about a man facing the ruins of his life and his world, and beautifully translated into English by Tess Lewis. Tess is a writer and translator from French and German. Her translations include works by Peter Handke, Walter Benjamin, Klaus Merz, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, Christine Angot, Pascal Bruckner, and Jean-Luc Benosilio. She has been awarded grants from Penn USA, Penn UK, and the NEA, a Max Geilinger translation grant for her translation of Philippe Jacotet, the ACFNY Translation Prize, and the 2017 Penn Translation Prize for her translation of the novel Angel of Oblivion by the Austrian writer Maya Haderlap. If you haven't read that novel. It's amazing. Absolutely fantastisch. Ich glaube, Engel des Vergessens auf Deutsch, richtig? Ja. And most recently, a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. She is co-chair of the Penn Translation Committee and advisory editor for the Hudson Review. Her essays and reviews have appeared in a number of journals and newspapers, including Book Forum, Partisan Review, the Hudson Review, World Literature Today, the Wall Street Journal, and the American Scholar. Now moving on to Uli. Ulrich Baer is university professor at NYU and has written numerous books on poetry, photography, and cultural politics, including Remnants of Song, Trauma and the Experience of Modernity in Charles Baudelaire and Paul Celan, and a special issue of New German Critique on Paul Celan, co-edited with Amir Eshel. He hosts leading thinkers to talk about big ideas and great books on the Think About It podcast, and please listen to it if you haven't discovered it already. His most recent book was published earlier this week with Warbler Press, Fictions of America, the Book of Firsts, co-edited with Smaranda Yal, which gathers all of the first publications by a range of American authors for the first time in an accessible anthology. Uli, please take it away. Welcome our panelists.
Thank you so much. So thank you, Juliana, and thank you to the Swiss Consulate for sponsoring this event. So Jonas Lüscher and Tess Lewis, I'm really excited to have you here, have you back. And we're going to go right in, and I would love Jonas to read a passage from his novel Kraft, which I have right here, which I loved. It's witty, it's acerbic, it's wicked, as Juliana said, and I have really some questions of what motivated you to write this book. And then you'll read a passage. Tess, you can give us a little bit of taste of your beautiful translation. And I'm really curious to hear you talk about not just the linguistic challenge or the excitement of translating a language, but you're translating a novel into a cultural space. So that is a much broader conversation than just a technical conversation. But Jonas, if it's okay, we'll start you reading a little bit. You can tell us maybe in a sentence or two. You'll read in German. And we have a lot of events at NYU in many languages. For those of you who do not speak German, just allow yourself to be sort of taken along the ride of Jonas's beautiful, lush, and very intricate German. And then Tess will give us the same passage in English, and then we'll start our conversation.
Good evening, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I will read from the first chapter, so I don't have to deliver any context. I think it will work like this. And it's only like 2 minutes in German. Erst hatte an einen Scherz geglaubt, als vor 6 Monaten Ivans Mail aus Stanford mit dem Betreff Theodizee geöffnet hatte. Aber Ivan beliebte nicht zu scherzen, noch nie. Auch damals schon nicht, als sie sich 81 in Berlin kennengelernt hatten und die regelmäßige Korrespondenz, die sie in den letzten Jahrzehnten ausgetauscht hatten, zeigte in ihrer schnörkellosen Sachlichkeit, dass weder die verstrichene Zeit noch die kalifornische Sonne daran etwas zu ändern vermocht hatte. Sorry. Dear Dick lautete die englische Anrede, an die sich Richard Kraft längst gewöhnt hatte, so wie er sich an das Ivan gewöhnt hatte, mit dem Istvan Pancel irgendwann, etwa zur gleichen Zeit, als kurze E-Mails, die mit der Maschine getippten Briefe aus dünnem blauen Luftpostpapier abgelöst hatten, seine Nachrichten zu unterzeichnen begann. Und dann fuhr er fort: Deine Teilnahme ist erwünscht, sämtliche Kosten übernehmen wir, give my regards to Heike and the Twins, best Ivan. Im Anhang fand Kraft die aufwendig gestaltete Ausschreibung einer Preisfrage, die man zum Anlass des 307. Jahrestages des Leibnizschen Essays zur Theodizee über die Güte Gottes, die Freiheit der Menschen und den Ursprung des Übels zu stellen gedachte. Und in Anlehnung an die Preisfrage der Berliner Akademie von 1753, gefordert wird die Untersuchung des Popschen Systems, wie es in dem Lehrsatz Alles ist gut enthalten ist, allerdings um einiges schlanker, aber auch optimistischer folgendermaßen formuliert hatte. The Odyssey and Technodyssey, Optimism for a Young Millennium, Why Whatever is right and why we still can improve it. Der Modus operandi war klar geregelt. Die Beiträge sollten an einem einzigen Nachmittag im CEMEX-Auditorium der Stanford University präsentiert werden. Eine schnelle Abfolge von Vorträgen, das Zeitlimit von 18 Minuten durfte nicht überschritten werden, der Einsatz von Präsentationssoftware war ausdrücklich erwünscht, das Publikum ausgewählt und die Luster, die Welt, die Organisatoren schienen sich sicher, dass die Welt interessiert sei, per Livestream zugeschaltet. Dem Verfasser der preiswürdigsten Antwort winkte $1 Million. Ja, dachte Kraft, damit durfte man sich natürlich der Aufmerksamkeit der Welt gewiss sein.
Thank you, Jonas. So Tess, you're going to read the same passage, right?
I will read the same passage.
Great.
I think that it will be clear, certainly to those of you who know German as well as English, how specific in particular Jonas's style is. At first, Kraft had taken it for a joke 6 months earlier when he'd opened Ivan's email from Stanford with the Odyssey in the subject line. But Ivan wasn't one for joking, never had been, not even back when they met in Berlin in '81, and their regular correspondence over the decades since showed, in all its sober practicality, that neither the passing years nor the California sunshine had changed Ivan at all in that respect. The email opened with, "Dear Dick," an English salutation Richard Kraft had gotten used to long before, just as he'd gotten used to the Ivan, which with Istvan Panchel had at some point begun signing his communications, about the same time that brief emails began replacing letters typed on thin blue email paper. Ivan's email continued. "We very much hope you will participate. We will cover all costs. Give my regards to Heike and the twins. Best, Ivan." In an attachment, Kraft found the lavishly designed call to enter the essay competition held in honor of the 307th anniversary of the publication of Leibniz's Theodicy, Essays on the Goodness of God, the Freedom of Man, and the Origin of Evil. The essay was to be on a subject based on the prize question set by the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1753, an examination of the system of Pope as it is contained in the dictum, "Whatever is right," albeit in a more streamlined but also more optimistic formulation. Theodicy and Technodyssey, Optimism for a Young Millennium. Why whatever is right and why we can still improve it. The modus operandi was clearly set out. All the submissions would be presented over the course of a single afternoon in Stanford University's CEMEX auditorium. The essays would be read aloud, one after the other in swift succession, with a strictly enforced 18-minute time limit. The use of presentation software was strongly encouraged. A select and illustrious audience would be in attendance, and the world, the organizers seemed confident of the world's interest, would be tuned in via live stream. The author of the winning essay would receive $1 million. Yes, indeed, Kraft thought, at that price, one can certainly be confident of catching the world's attention.
Thank you so much. To the two of you, Jonas and Tess, maybe I can start you out. So my question is really to ask Tess about how to approach a novel that Jonas, you set this novel up. This is a professor from Tübingen, very much part of old Europe. And the book opens with a portrait of Rumsfeld, who in 2003 very provocatively said there's old Europe and there's a new world order. You obviously playing on this. There's a European who's coming to America. He's invited to explain to us that technology can be our salvation, redemption, and a kind of utopian hope embodied in technology. You place him in Silicon Valley. And I loved reading the book as a story of a European coming to America and kind of making sense of America, which had always had this space of promising something that hadn't yet been attained, humanly possible. Obviously, it's kind of pushing one's horizons. That's why it's located on the West Coast, this kind of movement toward the setting sun. And then Tess's work was to translate this book into American, not just English, but into our sort of network of the cultural references. So Jonas, I'm going to start you out, and then Tess, I want you to come in to sort of say, what motivated you to write a book right now about a European, really an old European, a professor who's been challenged and for his particular life situation has to accept this challenge to say, I'm going to answer this Leibnizian question, this is the best of all worlds?
Well, I was a guest researcher at Stanford University for 9 months at the philosophy department. No, actually, I was at the language department. And there I quite early had the feeling that people really have a different mindset and a different language even, or a different vocabulary. And I was thinking about what is the main difference. And what struck me the most was that I had a feeling of there is so much optimism, especially this techno-optimism that you can save the world with an app and all this stuff. And it was kind of astonishing for me what a great difference I saw between the academic thinking in Germany, where I live, or in the Silicon Valley. And so I had the idea to send a German or a European professor into this setting and to experience this different cultural difference. And it would have been very easy, or it would have been an obvious idea to send an old leftist, the common leftist German professor, Alt-68er, what's the name for that in English, Tess?
An old 68er.
Yeah, an old 68er.
Liberals. I think they're called liberals.
Yeah, they're called liberals. Exactly.
They're called liberals right now, not progressive.
But that would have been kind of boring, because he would be the guy who was always kind of anti-American and anti-technology and stuff like this. So I decided to send a completely different guy, because this Kraft, Professor Kraft, he's a conservative, neoliberal in the sense of his economic thinking. He's a Thatcherite and a believer in Reaganomics. So he's a really different character than the normal, standard German professor, how you would normally write about. Because it was much more interesting for me to see him go there and see all his dreams he had dreamt of his whole life, see them coming to life and being fulfilled. And I think sometimes there is nothing more horrible than when your dreams come true. Yeah. So he actually, when he sees how life is in the Silicon Valley and how the thinking really is, he's kind of struggles with that.
But it's great how you take him. He's in Berlin when Reagan is elected and when Reagan comes. So it's kind of Reaganomics, then Thatcher, this kind of unshackling of the market forces. And then he's in Palo Alto today, Silicon Valley, where supposedly all these mostly guys put all this into practice in a way that even Reagan could not have imagined.
Yeah.
So Tess, when you read the book first, you're actually encountering this. He's an old European, but Jonas, as you're saying, he's not old. He's actually the next generation. He's not 68. He's not old European. But so Tess, you encountered him, and you have to make him come alive in our American idiom. But he's also a little bit distanced from that American reality, because he's thinking, and as Jonas, I'm really interested when you said they're using a different language. He's thinking not in German, but the language itself is kind of charged with this optimism. So Tess, how did you, on your first reading, experience Jonas's language, and how to hear that sound in English?
Well, there's a number of parallel strands in this novel, and I was just blown away, absolutely amazed at the way that Jonas could capture stylistically all sorts of philosophical fault lines. So there's old Europe, there's new America, there's the different political and economic interests within the different European countries. You know, does Thatcherism translate to Germany? I mean, yes, but not really. And while the internecine politics that Jonas portrays so wryly may be familiar to Germans, but not to us, it was astounding to me that how many parallels kept coming up between what was going on in Germany then and what the kind of power plays that are going on in the various branches of government here. So it's not the same, but it's a similar dynamic. But at the same time, so there's the cultural differences. There's also the split personality, or the personality that's splitting ever wider in Kraft as he goes along and realizes that his dream has come true and it's a nightmare. And so the style, the sentences become increasingly convoluted and intricate, illustrate the contortions that Kraft himself is going through to write something that he doesn't want to write or doesn't feel comfortable writing anymore. It's bringing him up, it's forcing him to face himself and the consequences of his beliefs. And so, you know, a reviewer or two has said, oh, you know, it's just another book about a professor who can't write. Well, it's not really true. I mean, it is true in a very superficial way, but he can't write because there is a philosophical revolution going on in his mind that portrays revolutions that have gone on philosophically, economically, and politically over the last 5 decades. So I just thought it was this fascinating dramatization of thought and politics in the mind of one man.
Let me ask Jonas something about this. This guy is supposed to write this philosophical treatise. So treatise on this question is the whatever is right and can we improve it? And then he's trying to cobble together the whole history of intellectual thought, really from Socrates to Hölderlin to Badiou or something like that, and say, okay, I'm going to take all these pieces and I'm going to convince this rich guy because I need the money and he's an idiot, but he's a powerful idiot. And Tess just said, maybe this whole philosophical edifice of Europe cannot even really address what is happening here because something has shifted. So when you wrote these sentences, and actually I did this because it's a great question to ask any German language writer, your third sentence in the book runs to 137 words, which is just gorgeous and amazing. But in some ways, did you try to write a book where this guy is supposed to explain the world from a philosophical premise and in a language that he's realizing maybe doesn't work anymore?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I even start the book by him sitting in front of this Rumsfeld portrait in the Hoover Foundation library. And because he's so unnerved from this strange look from Rumsfeld that he says himself, I'm going to search for a really European tone. And then the whole book, except not the last chapter, there he loses this tone and it's a very American tone. But the rest of the book it is a European, an old European, almost old-fashioned Thomas Mann-like tone, which is, I think, for any translator really hard, because if a writer starts writing his book and in the first paragraph he says, I'm gonna write in a European tone, and then you have to translate this to English, it's kind of, how do you do that? Yeah. So
how do you do that, Tess? It's a good question.
It was I would say one of the hardest translations I've had to do. I mean, and maybe it's good to illustrate this with one sentence. So Sarah, could you put up the, so if you go, we can skip the puns on Kraft's name because even the title caused endless discussion. So
wait, Tess, say one thing about the title, but Kraft just because what people just, and let's go to your.
We can the puns and then go to the unpacking. The problem with Kraft as a word is that it means so many things. It can't be translated with just one word. It means force, power, strength, energy, vigor, effect, manpower, virility, ability, oomph even. And Jonas interweaves the name all through the novel with puns on it. He's got epigraphs that in the German translation play with the word Kraft, but I couldn't even translate those consistently. And so my wonderful editor, Jeremy Davies, and I decided not to translate the name to Richard Power or Powers, because there's also a very well-known novelist here, Richard Powers, and do our best, or do my best, with the various puns on Kraft. So for this one in particular, es ist nur noch wenig Kraft in ihm. So what Jonas is saying, there's very little of Kraft himself in himself, because it's an idiomatic expression. And so I translated that as Kraft is but a shadow of himself, because I couldn't, there was no other way to do it with the name, and it wouldn't have worked. I mean, I suppose I could have played on something with powered and being disempowered, but that has other connotations that would have taken it down a rabbit hole. And for example, with the epigraphs, Jonas was using a German translation of Balzac that said, Kraft besteht nicht ohne Goethe, from La force ne va pas sans bonté. And power does not exist without kindness is not exactly the same thing as saying strength doesn't exist without kindness. But the tragedy here is that the cleverness is gone. So he's saying Richard Kraft can't subsist without goodness. And this is a theme throughout the novel of how he relies on more or less generous women, all of them more generous than he, to make his way in the world. And without them, he wouldn't be where he is today. Or, you know, wo die Kraft nicht reicht, kommt die Täuschung hinzu, from a 18th century libretto. Where force doesn't suffice, Ruse steps in. But really, it's where Kraft himself fails, then he has to resort to Ruse. So that is sort of the overarching problem, which is much, it truly is one as much of tone as it is of cleverness. And so I'm afraid a good deal of the novel did not, I don't want to say got lost in translation, but didn't quite adequately get carried over. But in terms of tone, Sarah, if you would go to the next page. So this here is an example of my nightmares come true, because not only is it a convoluted sentence that is showing Kraft trying to wrestle himself into productivity using, you know, political history with Margaret Thatcher, Greek history that Isaiah Berlin had been referencing in his Fox and Hedgehog essay. And it's all, you know, it's folded in on itself. So I had to basically take the whole sentence apart, put it back together following English syntax, because being an uninflected language, there's less flexibility. And on top of that, there is this idiomatic expression, noch eine runde Sache war, which meant that, you know, it was also sort of too pat a conclusion. But this is in the context of the hedgehog's self-defense of rolling itself into a ball and having its quills stick out. So if you go to the English, Sarah, the next page, from the very first sentences, he, Kraft, was on familiar territory again, in the great intellectual historian's skeptical thinking, conveniently enough also appreciated by Margaret Thatcher, since Isaiah Berlin believed Archilochus's enigmatic sentence about the hedgehog and the fox could be easily understood to mean that the fox, for all his cunning, is no match for the one defense of the hedgehog, a defense that was, at least in Kraft's view, repellently straightforward. So instead of, you know, I tried things with closing the circle, you know, and all that, but I ended up going repellently straightforward, as in straightness being the opposite of a circle. So I tried with those various strategies to make it readable and smooth, but reflect a sort of skeptical, if not, you know, sardonic tone of the world-weary European intellectual. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's great. Jonas, you put a lot of, what a good German professor would know, a lot of references there at Berlin, but then there's a lot of other references. Do you think your readers catch those, or do they generally get the idea that he's using these philosophical little bricks to build this fantasy essay that he's having a hard time writing in this incredible environment? And the Hoover Institute is all, I like the way you represent it. And I know you were a guest there. My friend Amir Eschel says hello. He was really happy that I have you here today. He's in this incredible utopia of the Stanford campus, which is built in a complicated way as a sort of memorial to the Leland Stanford, but is the future itself. Do you think your readers in America, what do they make of these references? Because not all of them will be available. And that's your first question for you, Jonas. And then Tess, do you do any explaining around these names or not?
Yeah, that's always kind of a problem. But on the other hand, I think I always try to write my books a way that you can read them on different levels, I would say. So I think you can read the book without getting every reference. But maybe if you have studied philosophy or literature, you will have sometimes some more fun. That might be, but I always try to use the references as kind of a spicing, but not something you have to understand to understand the book. It's more like there's more flavor if you understand, if you get it all, but it's not necessary totally. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's kind of nice, I think, that the book is translated into English now, because there is a lot of German history and German politics in it. There is a whole chapter about just one debate in the German Bundestag, in the parliament, from 1st October 1982, when Chancellor Kohl came to power. And it's like 45 pages only about German politics. And somehow I like it that American readers have to read that now, because in Germany, we are really into American politics. We read a lot of American politics, know a lot of American politics. So it's good that you have to do that now.
And say something before Tess, say something. What happens at that moment in Germany? So Kohl is elected and Reagan is elected in America, or Kohl is giving a speech. And how does your narrator, who's a young student who figures out putting yourself in this, what we today call this neoliberal side of history, he'll succeed. And then this refugee from Eastern Europe realizes the free market is the solution, the answer. You can't argue with him really, he comes out of communism, and you have this kind of divide in the world. What is happening in Europe in Germany at this time politically?
Well, we had before, for quite a long time, social democratic government, but together with the liberal, which is a market liberal party, and they had a coalition for quite a while. And together with the oil crisis, worldwide, the economy went down in Germany quite a bit by the end of the 70s. So there was a lot of unemployment and stuff like this. And Chancellor Kohl came up, or he was then just a normal congressman and the leader of his party. And he said, we need a complete change in a geistig moralisch, which would mean like a change in mind and moral for the whole nation. That's what he promised he would bring. And then there was this one guy who brought up a paper which was really like a Thatcherite Reaganomics paper, which split up this whole coalition and brought up a new government under Kohl. And for many, this was kind of a hopeful moment, because they thought, now we are going to follow the American or the British path. But actually, the interesting thing is that not really much changed. There was no change in moral and nothing. The Kohl government was quite boring for a long time and didn't change a lot. And it was, in my book, it's kind of a disappointment for Kraft and Istvan.
And when he comes to America, there's this, you go from this kind of 80s, early 80s to what happens in Europe to the story in America today. And there's an idea that there's yet another promise that's not political, but that's technological. Mm-hmm. And that we will hand over our decisions to algorithms, etc. Can you say a little bit about that, your own attitude? You said there was an optimism in Silicon Valley. It's a positive thing. People put a lot of hope. And we're living in this pandemic. We're going to put an enormous amount of faith in technology, possibly even more than we did before.
That's right. And I mean, it's nothing I would make just fun about, because I do, even in this pandemic, have a lot of hope in technology. But it is more a certain tone people use when they speak about those things. It's often very hyperbolic. And I often had a feeling that everybody at Stanford University or in the Silicon Valley try to sell an idea or to sell themselves. I remember one thing I experienced. We went after an event at the university. We went for dinner in a huge group, and somebody drove me in his car, and I was in the back seat of the car with a young lady with some roots in India, I believe. And I asked her what she's doing, and she said she's the CEO of a mining company. And I suddenly was like, all my fantasy went off, and I thought, oh, okay, she has Indian heritage. She's maybe the ear of a huge mining business, iron mining or copper mining or stuff like this. And after 5 minutes, I found out that she just started a startup which will collect all cell phones and mine the seltene Erden, the raw earth out of it. So it's a small recycling business, not a mining company. But people have to sell their idea like crazy, and in this optimism, and yeah.
Tess, did you this kind of flavor of this guy is both seduced by this, right? There's a part of it, I think, where he's not just saying, I'm going to win $1 million, but I feel he's always on the precipice of thinking, this is going to work. There is something here that because he's coming also from Europe, and he's coming from his own personal situation, which isn't really easy. And there's the hope of a new language, the hope of redemption, and the hope of rekindling his old love. So did you think, Tess, through the second part of the book, there's a different kind of energy than in the first part?
There is, yeah, and his hope keeps coming up against repeated disillusions, but Jonas plays really nicely with the seductions of hope. There's a scene where he overhears two Stanford business graduate school students talking about what they're developing, and I mean, the world really seems to be their oyster. They have this, to all extents and purposes, completely useless app about fame and, influencing and whatnot. But it really will open worlds in ways they don't expect. And Kraft is jealous. But then when it kind of goes into young girls' bedrooms, young boys, children, it's kind of that, it has that invasive side of technology today, and Kraft thinks back on his own daughters and suddenly is horrified. So his hopes keep butting up against his horror, and you get that in the second half of the book. That happens much more frequently and to much greater effect than in the beginning.
Jonas, you have a very funny scene where he goes out rowing in this little skiff, and I actually happened to be a rower, and I was on a crew team for a very long time, which took me to Palo Alto several times, and I was a college rower. But it's a very funny scene of kind of a European encountering the American landscape. I think this kind of, you think you're going to have the American sublime and kind of like an Ansel Adams Yosemite experience, and instead he's sort of paddling around in the kind of brackish sort of water of San Francisco Bay with the skyline. And It's like, I really like this scene because it sort of confronts this. I think there's the fantasy of Europe. And a lot of people think, oh, I get America. I'm a European, I've been there, I've lived there. It's like, nobody in America gets America. That's what's great about America. Like, Tess, I was interested, have you been to this landscape? Have you been to the San Francisco Bay? And did when you were translating, did you really feel what, because Jonas, you've been there. This is obviously grounded in some part of real experience, right? Did you actually wash up next to the seals in a skiff or something? And
no, I have to confess that I haven't been to the bay there at this, it's called Bear Island. Because this idea of the rowing scene, I had it when I was back in Germany, and I actually did all my research on the internet.
It's good. I like it. I like that he loses everything, and then he's in a kind of perfunctory way also build the replacement cost, which is suddenly astronomically high for him.
Yeah, and it's an important scene because Kraft has to experience together with the reader that without technology, it is so easy from Europe to, to laugh about Silicon Valley and technology, but in the end, we're completely dependent on it. And when you are this naked being in a landscape, just even if the Silicon Valley is very close and the skyline of Silicon Valley, he's in danger, really. He's drowned almost, he's freezing almost to death. And I wanted to show that we are, as beings, we are dependent of technology.
Tess, what's your take on that scene? It's also very much of a male scene, this kind of male ego, basically almost drowning in 8 feet of water or something. It's kind of this whole mismatch of him, this man, and then he's not even in the Pacific in a hurricane. He's in this little thing.
And he's threatened and humiliated by the wildlife, from the little ducks passing by to the seals on shore. I think it's a fabulous scene, but. I'm surprised to hear you hadn't been there, Jonas, because a daughter of a friend of mine was actually at the time a Cox on the Stanford crew team. So I, was checking, fact checking and getting the right terminology and all that. So it's a wonderful scene.
It's a very effective scene. Another scene I really like is where he goes and visits his lost love. It's very beautiful in a way, and you have a very funny way of describing the routine annoyance of renting a car or something like that with the deep romantic hope of reconnecting with somebody. It's kind of this, like he's driving and thinking about the rental car, which way to go. And at the same time, he thinks his life will finally be redeemed, right? I have to ask you now, you didn't win on the Bay. Is that based on your own life experience? Have you done this kind of trip down memory lane?
No. Absolutely not. I was in the Bay Area with my wife the whole time, and we are not in divorce. We don't have twins. My wife even doesn't have what is it called? Bunions? Bunions. That's everybody asks me. Your wife must have bunions because I write a lot of stuff. No, this is just made up.
The wonderful ending of that scene, or culmination of the scene, is the realization, not to spoil anything, but Kraft realizes that he was living in an absolutely alternate universe as his great love. They experienced these same years utterly differently.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question that ties, there's a couple of very specific questions about post-German unification and whether the unification violates some kind of World War II agreement of German soldiers never outside of Germany, which was violated long before German unification. My brother actually made several movies about this, so I know this from my family research. But this idea that a German man has a particular struggle with masculinity, which is maybe different for Americans to understand. Because I think, and Tess, you can maybe start there, I think people reading a book about Germany have a lot of associations in their head, and still the book will still be filtered somewhat by the questions in the chat right now saying German post-war history.
Well, this was alluded to earlier when Jonas was talking about the specific moment in time politically. I had to work in quite a few hidden glosses, particularly, I had to make a decision every time the word liberal came up, because it means it's so different here than it is. Here it's classical liberalism. There it's free market liberalism. So we had to work that out. I had to put in a few words to show that Oggersheim, where Cole made his announcement, was, Jonas can do shorthand for those moments in German, but, so I would, in consultation with the editor, decide which things needed that hidden gloss and which could be left to Google. But I think that the complexities of, masculinity in post-war Germany is actually beautifully displayed in this novel, specifically in the scene where Kraft realizes that his father played a part in the war that was never talked about to him, and the way the father treated his mother, and then how that plays out in the way Kraft treats women in the novels. So yes, but I think because the story is so specific and so engaging, even if Kraft himself is often off-putting, that it is accessible for American readers. At least I hope.
Could you say something, Jonas, about what Tess just alluded to? You edged this protagonist to a place of him not being so likable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually quite a complicated thing, but I don't have to give you a catalog of unlikable characters in fiction, who sometimes are actually the most powerful or charismatic or magnetic ones. But what was your own relationship in living with this man for quite a long time, I assume, when you're writing the book? Was he someone you liked, you cared about, you felt compassion for?
Compassion, of course. I think if you write about a guy for such a long time, you have to have at least a huge interest in him. But yeah, I don't like him. Absolutely not. And sometimes I still see myself in him with my own faults, my own vanity or stuff like this, But for me, it was interesting to write about him in a certain ironic style, which brings, what's the opposite of close? A distance between, there is a huge distance between me and the character, and also between the reader and the character. It's not a book where you can bind easily with the main character. And I'm very much interested when I write in exactly this distance, because I would like to bring the reader to a point where he always realizes that somebody is telling him the story now, and that he has to think about who is telling me the story now and why is he doing it? What are the questions of power behind telling this story? So I don't want to, pull in the reader completely into the story. I like to have to bring the reader into a certain intellectual distance to the story.
And there's also, with that play on distance and appeal and repulsion of Kraft as a character, it sort of reflects the toxic masculinity that he embodies, particularly at the beginning of the novel, is subject to repeated humiliations. And so it makes him more and more human and more vulnerable. And until the end, pity is perhaps too strong a word, but Jonas sort of bridges the gap between, dislike and compassion through the trials that he undergoes, whether it's ending up naked in the bay or confronting an old love who actually hasn't thought about him much since. And that's beautifully done, the way that a dislikable character is humanized is one of the
I also think part of what I think he's falling victim to his own stories. He tells himself something, you think that's going to hold up, and then he's disappointed. And then can you say something about his kind of counterpart, that Eastern European intellectual who has the career and somehow finds his version of the American dream in Stanford. There's something about him which he has the life that people maybe envy, but there's also some kind of hollowness or sort of something not quite right about it.
That's true, yeah. For me, he's kind of a, even his name is pointing in this direction. Istvan Panzel, he's Kraft's Pangloss. Mm-hmm. He's the guy who guides him through his life with his sort of philosophy. Right. And for him, for Kraft, it's important because Kraft decides to become a market liberal because he wants to distinguish himself from all the leftist students. But then he gets friends with Istvan, and he realizes that there can be like a much more serious idea from this political idea, because Istvan fled communism and he has this almost Ayn Rand kind of change from communism to complete liberalism. The big problem of Istvan is that his whole life is based on a lie, because he in the beginning of the book,
it's a good lie. Don't give it away. It's so good.
I don't give it away. Yeah, it's a huge lie.
It's so funny though. It's such a great lie, and you kind of can't blame him for lying at that moment. You really cannot.
No, that's true.
And I think, Jonas, I think it says something about America, because he becomes an American success story, and America is full of confidence men and people who pretended something and gave themselves a new identity. And I think this fantasy of a new identity, he fulfills this twice. When he washes up in Berlin, and then when he washes up in Stanford, and both times he denies part of the past. But that's a very American dimension.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, the whole literature of America is populated with confidence men and tricksters and people who have to invent a past, either because it was robbed from them, or because it was traumatic, or because they can't acknowledge it. So I think Istvan is sort of a character. He's the Mephisto to the Faust. He is the kind of, as you said, he is the one who's corrupting him in a certain way, also into this idea that if you just let go of your past, Stanford will be perfect and beautiful, because you live in a timeless utopian present.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And
history kind of follows him, because in the moment when the Berlin Wall falls down, it starts to be difficult for him, because his unique selling point is being a Eastern European dissident, and that's not that interesting anymore. And he always has to fear that some Eastern European professor who knows him from his youth will come and discover his lie. And so
actually, I went to college with someone who had a story like this, but I won't put it in public here. I'll tell you about it at some point. Someone whose entire life collapsed when the Berlin Wall collapsed, because it depended on people not being able to know something about the eastern part of Europe. And so people came out of the eastern part of Europe and had a different story. And Tess, just to, on a larger level, sort of where you look at when your interest in German literature, German language literature in general, you took this novel on because you have so many options and choices. What moved you right now in 2019 or 2020 to read this when America is also going through a very serious process of self-reflection?
I think it is absolutely timely, and it's funny because this has been a long process. So Jonas published it in 2017, and it won the Swiss Book Prize. And then, Farrar took it on, and then it had to be translated. And then there was the pandemic. And then there was, actually before the pandemic, there was the election. And already publishers were nervous about bringing books out around the election because, there would be no attention left for books, which I think we're finding is borne out. But they believed in Kraft as one of the books that could stand up to the, oxygen suck that politics was bound to be. And then on top of that, there was the pandemic. So I was excited about the book because I think that it's thorough, calling into question and examination, not just of the theory of free market neoliberalism, but a close look at the way it touches people's lives on a personal level. So it's not about how, the people who are left behind, economically. It's really about sort of the soul-sucking effect of free market liberalism on thinking aware, people who fancy themselves to be morally sound. And I think that is an important message, always, but especially now. So I was excited about the book. I loved Jonas's first book, Barbarian Spring. And that's why, because I liked that novella so much, that's why I invited him to FNL. And so I was thrilled when I was able to publish this one. I think the parallels to today are astonishing. Where I was going with the delays is, as Farrar Strass-Giroux kept delaying the book, I thought, oh my goodness, it's such a timely book, it may not wear well. But in my opinion, it gets more and more timely as things develop. So I was thrilled to do it.
Well, and I think what's interesting is in this country, in America, we are in a very serious debate about the role of technology, including social media. As we all know, I mean, they dragged Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg before Congress several times. I'm saying dragged, but because people realize they are a force in society globally that had not happened before. And they are sort of the unelected masters of the universe. Jonas, before I'm going to ask you what you're working on now, which is a question in the chat, what do you make of America right now? Because you wrote a book that's very political, very timely, as Tess said, and we're really happy it's gotten a lot of attention already in America, which is great. So I think, as Tess said, it really says something about today. But where do you see our moment right now? And I'm asking you not just because you're a writer, but because your book is actually very topical to all the issues that we're going through in it. I mean, we don't even have election results in America right now. We do, but half the country doesn't accept them. We do, yeah, well, I haven't gotten the memo from the other half of America yet. So.
It's a difficult question, but of course, I mean, right now it's kind of a feeling of great relief, because I was full of sorrow watching the elections, and I mean, like everybody, and I watched it very closely, and I do read the American newspaper every day, and I'm kind of also fascinated, and it's an important country for me, and which is kind of interesting too, because this is a tradition for Swiss writers. For Max Frisch, America was an important country too, and you can read his diaries from the time he spent in the 60s, in the early 60s, or even late 50s in his first time in the States, and it's always this love to the country, but then also like really having big problems with certain ideas or certain things. So that's kind of same for me. I'm always fascinated. I like to read American literature, and I consume a lot of American culture. But on the other hand, I mean, the what's the word, Spaltung, Tess?
Polarization or division.
Polarization, yeah. The polarization of the society now is kind of frightening, because I mean, in Germany we have the same on a much smaller scale, but it's getting bigger and bigger too. So sometimes I'm afraid what we can see today in the States, that will be the future of Europe too. Yeah, and now I think a lot has broken in the last 4 years, and it will be very interesting how quickly this can heal, if it can heal at all in this difficult situation with the pandemic and everything. And sure, I mean, there has to be a question about which role this huge technology companies play in the whole society. But at least I think that's something which is debated now. And as you said, they have to answer questions in front of the Congress. And at least I have a feeling, yeah, it's an important topic and everybody knows, which is a first step.
And it does impact, it has its impact in your book that actually this man's life and everybody's life is fundamentally challenged, and he sees it as an opportunity, and then he grows disenchanted by it.
Yeah.
And whether the whole edifice of thinking and writing and deliberating and talking, what we're doing right now, whether ultimately this can be replaced by a bunch of algorithmic responses. You know, there is an idea that I'm looking at the chat right now that in the future, there's just an algorithm and just answers will just pop up.
Yeah.
Versus us, you actually talking about it. And there were a couple of questions, how you structured the book, whether you liked some of the epigraphs more than others. And a very, very deep question, is it better to be entrapped by one's past or to lie about it and create a fiction? I would say something like Nietzsche, to say there is no past that is not a fiction. That history writing is, of course, always creating a story that makes sense for us, rather than there's the truth versus there's the fiction.
Yeah.
Do you have any favorite epigraphs or something when you were writing the book? Do you treat them the way he treats these philosophical sound bites to construct an essay, or do you actually value them more deeply than that?
It depends. I mean, some of them are more like fun. There's like an excerpt of Hildegard Hambrüchner's doctoral thesis in chemistry about some yeast or something like this. That's more kind of a joke.
Yeah.
But then there are some more pop culture references I really like the one from The Martian. I'm really going to science the shit out of it. Which is fantastic, which cost the publishing house a lot of money. 20th Century Fox, was it 20? I think that was the yeah. They wanted quite a bit of money for this one sentence.
Funnily enough, I have it right here. The Martian.
Okay, yeah.
It's one of the many books next to my Rilke and Nietzsche and Hölderlin I keep handy.
Very good. But I think the sentence is only in the.
Yes, you haven't read it?
Movie. It's not in the
beautiful.
book.
It's about the utopian idea of recreating the world. It's a really beautiful book, right?
But the film is something completely different. It's all about technology and just yeah.
It's really funny. Yeah. The first line of this book also very famous. I'm pretty much fucked. That's the opening of the novel. It's a good premise for today, I think. But Tess, we're going to have to wrap up, although I'd love to keep you going a little bit. Did you work with Jonas on the translation and check up and have contact and try to get sort of direction?
Jonas was very generous. He actually went through my whole translation and saved me from a few embarrassing mistakes. And sometimes just felt that the tone was a little off. So Sarah, actually, could you put up the PowerPoint again? And I can give a quick show. Go to the last page, I think. No, the one that says capturing the wit. Okay, so here, it's a difficult, the tone and the delicacy of register in here is complicated. Am meisten bewunderte er Bertrand aber dafür, weil es ihm gelingt, trotz dieser Leichtfüßigkeit in Fragen der Lebensführung ein zwar unverbesserlicher Lenker, aber eben auch ein ausgesprochen streitbarer Gast zu sein. So it's not as awkward as my first attempt was. And so when I tried, this is an example of my unpacking the sentences. What he admires most about Bertrand, however, is that despite his ease and suavity in matters of lifestyle, he is an inveterate leftist and outspoken polemicist. And it's just kind of clunky and it's too literal. And actually, because I had my mind so deep in it, I didn't quite catch it right away. And when I sent it to Jonas, he wrote back that I had missed the coloring, that he said, I think the coloring doesn't quite fit. So I then reworked it into what he admires most about Bertrand, however, is that for all his ease and agility and in matters of lifestyle, he still remains an inveterate leftist and an outspoken polemicist. So that got, I think, that sort of distance. There's a small typo in there, but you get the idea. Thank you, Sarah. So being able to send it to Jonas, and even if he didn't know the right answer, he could at least flag things where he thought I had gone too far one way or another, or didn't catch the flow. So I'm very grateful for Jonas. It was wonderful working together, and he was generous with his time.
Did you not want to rewrite your book, Jonas, when you had to look at it that closely?
Yeah, it's horrible, always. Yes. And you learn a lot about your writing, because all those questions, I mean, translators are the most frightening readers, because they really read very closely. Yeah. And they often want to know why you have done something like this and not like that. And you, in writing, you do it intuitively, but then you have to find a reason, and you have to, and then that's exactly the moment where you learn a lot about your own writing, about your handcraft. Yeah.
And it's very subtle, and it's enormous. It takes enormous concentration. I translate a lot, as Tess knows, and I'm retranslating in the Nietzsche edition. They're glaring mistakes that everybody has made every single time. And I know exactly why they made the mistake, because it's a letter off from another expression in German, and they hear that other expression. And it's just incredibly subtle, what you're saying, that Tess probably read it more closely than you ever have, right here. As a Swiss writer, one of the questions is, how do you feel about, you're located in Germany, I believe, right now. Yeah. And I wanted to say, I said something earlier already. I've heard a bunch of conversations you've had with other people, and there's a kind of quickness, and people say, I'm really an expert in America. I lived in America for X years. Mm-hmm. Like, I've lived in America for 35 years. I don't understand anything about America. And I always like this idea that people think they get it. It takes you as a European writer to show something about America. Mm-hmm. It takes you maybe as a Swiss writer to show something about Berlin in the 80s that someone who's from there wouldn't say. But what's your relationship to the space you're working in?
Well, I mean, my previous book was kind of a Swiss book, and there was also some Swiss expressions in it, and the main character was Swiss and things like this. But this book is a deeply German book, because it's rooted in the German history, and which was kind of nice, because when I started writing the book, I just became German. I got German citizenship. So it was it fit very well that I dived deep into the German history. And for this writing about America, I mean, it's kind of easy the way I did it, because it's a very European viewpoint. And I always say it's a European viewpoint, because it's this, it's Kraft writing about or talking about America. So I don't pretend that I have an inside view on America. It is a European view.
But I think this is all literature ultimately provides us with a viewpoint slightly outside of our world. Yeah. And I also think the fantasy of understanding a country from within is a very risky fantasy. And I think what you said earlier, the polarization in America shows that if there's one interpretation for this country, it's probably incorrect. If there's only one, that would work. Mm-hmm. There was a question in the chat. What are you working on now?
Well, that's kind of difficult to say, because I'm quite in the beginning. It's a larger novel I started writing in last winter, and then I had Corona for many months and was very sick, and I couldn't work for many months, and I'm just restarting writing on this manuscript, and it's kind of difficult, because it feels a little bit like it was another guy who wrote it. And in some sense, this is true, because I went through this life-threatening things. So I am kind of a different guy now. And I'm trying to find a way to work again on this manuscript. And it will have to do, well, it's kind of it came up when I was working on Kraft. There is one short passage about artificial intelligence and about the notion of singularity. And this is a topic which I think follows me since many years, and I would like to write about that in a specific way. But a big part of the book plays in the First World War. So it's not a science fiction book or anything like this. And I can't say much about it because it's really in the beginning.
Okay. But Jonas, we talked about this really before, but we're all really happy you're here and you can do this right now. And it's really must have been horrible. So we're really sorry that you had to go through this. And the idea that you have to recover what happened before you were so ill must be really hard to be back in this normal.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to find back to what I did before. Yeah.
Yeah, and is there? I'm going to ask the two of you to. We'll probably have to close. I think Juliana and Sarah are going to tell me that. But although I really love this, what are some of the writers you're reading, or have you been able to read? I mean, I know you were really sick, so you probably weren't able to read. But anybody, sort of, for our audience, who are you mentally conversing?
Right now, I've just read the new book from Dorothee Elmiger. I think Tess knew her too. She's a Swiss writer. She's also translated into English, I think.
She is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Schlafgänger. What's the title in English? I don't know.
The sample is translated as shift sleepers.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. And can you say the name again, Jonas, for our audience?
Dorothee Elmiger.
Okay. And
the new book is called Aus der Zuckerfabrik, from the sugar factory. It's a fantastic book. It's not actually a novel. It's more like a research she's doing. And her style is quite unique and very, very precise. She's really fantastic.
Okay. So maybe we can convince the Swiss consulate to have you maybe speak with her. That would be wonderful.
That would be wonderful, yeah.
And Tess, what are you reading, or what are you doing while you're not going through the intricacies of someone else's language?
Well, unfortunately, I'm late on deadline, so I'm not reading anything that I don't have to at the moment. But I've obviously not learned my lesson. I am just finishing a new translation of Ernst Jünger's Auf den Marmorklippen, which also has disturbing parallels to today, but absolutely no sense of humor whatsoever. It's about the rise of a dangerous populist demagogue who basically causes the destruction of a rather refined Western civilization simply for his own particular ends. It's billed as sort of a resistance novel against the Nazis, but it's far more slippery and evasive than that. It's a disturbing book. So that's unfortunately where my head has been.
So that's not fun. So Elmiger is maybe the way to go, actually. Like, not for fun, but for not to read about a takeover. Jonas, I really want to thank you. I want to thank Tess also. Here's the book, Kraft. It's really wonderful, and Tess, congratulations for making it come alive in English. And we're really happy that it's already gotten a lot of attention. We will, of course, post this conversation, and we really hope, first of all, we're happy to see you, Jonas, that you're well to do this, and we hope to have you again at an event with Deutsches Haus and the Swiss consulate. And I'm going to hand it over to Juliana, and I want to thank you actually for making me. I lived in California. I actually moved from West Berlin to California in 1986, and threw away my return ticket. So there was a lot of things I connected to in this book, this fantasy of finding a new life, which I kind of did actually. So knock on wood. I became an American. So for me, part of the fantasy worked.
Yeah. Thank you, Uli. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Uli, your wish will come true on December 14th, which is the date we have picked for our upended conversation, where Jonas will also be one of the 3 other participants upended. So, but of course, we look forward to having an event on your next novel whenever that may be ready. And I want to thank all 3 of you for this very rich conversation and for shedding light on your creative process, on the translation process, on the collaborative process. I think it's been very insightful for us to see how many questions there are to be discussed for a great translation to come out. And how cumbersome the process is, and how inspiring it is, and how the writer can always learn from the translator, and the translator can maybe learn a little bit from the writer, and we can learn from both of you. And of course, a huge thanks to Uli, who is always so graceful in moderating our events. So
for me, it's the greatest thing. I get to read and think, and then I looked at everything you've done online. So Jonas, it's really sort of meeting somebody on this level. It's the best. So thank you. For me, it's really fantastic. Really.
Well, I'm glad everybody's on the same page. And please join us on Monday if you have time for our Celebrating Celan event at 12 p.m. Jonas, best wishes for your continued recovery and for your creative person as a new man. And we look forward to seeing the results soon, and see you all very soon virtually. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zara. Bye-bye.